Let's go ahead and get this evening's program going. My name is Jen Chambers. I am the Assistant Vice President of Lifelong Learning at Duke Alumni Engagement and Development. Welcome to this evening's first session in the World of Water series as part of the Forever Learning Institute. We started the Institute last spring to offer educational sessions to alums no matter where you live, so that you can hear from some of the amazing Duke faculty. The purpose of this series is also to bring together voices from across the institution. So tonight we will be hearing from one of our Fuqua faculty members, Dan Vermeer. Dan is the Executive Director for the Center for Energy Development and Global Environment, which is also known as EDGE on campus. He founded that program back in 2010. He's been at Duke for about 14 years, and he is also the Associate Professor of the Practice in Energy and the Environment. Just prior to being at Duke, he was at Coca-Cola and worked on their global water initiatives. And this evening, he will be talking about the economy of water. We will put his full bio into the link below. Pay special attention to that last paragraph in his bio. I think Dan is one of the more interesting faculty members we've had on recently with a very diverse background. He started off as an anthropologist and is now over at the Fuqua School of Business. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Dan, to get our session started.
Great. Thanks, Jen. It's great to be here. I'm really excited to be part of this series on the value of water. Looking at the other speakers that are going to be joining the session later in the year, I'm really pleased to be able to kick off this discussion. Water is one of my passions, one of the things that really got me excited and got me involved in the sustainability work over 20 years ago now. And I'm really excited to share some of the insights and experiences I've had in this space with you to kick off the series and hopefully to queue up some of the discussions that the other faculty will go deeper on. I'm going to just walk you through the presentation. I'm going to pull up my slides here a moment. So I just wanted to note the idea of the value of water. I was really intrigued by that concept when Jen and the others approached me about this, because it really, I think, points out one of the key issues about water, which is that it's in some way infinitely valuable, and in another way, it's really highly undervalued, at least economically, that we don't often pay the full price of water, and we don't treat it as the valuable resource that it really is. And so I think that's really helpful in kind of framing the way that I want to sort of take the conversation today. So, you know, we live on a planet that, depending on how you look at it, is incredibly water rich. This is a satellite image, actually, of the Earth at a particular point in its rotation. And from that view, almost all you see is water. So the Pacific Ocean covers a good part of the planet. You know, this is very unique in most of the planetary systems that we know. So we worry about water scarcity, but in one sense, we are an incredible water abundant planet, and it shapes everything that we do. So, but even though there's a lot of water on the planet, most of that water is in the ocean, as the satellite image demonstrated. About 97.5% of all of the water on the planet is in the ocean. So of the 2.5% that's fresh water, a good portion of that is actually locked up in the glaciers, which, you know, climate is having an impact on those, but most of the fresh water that's available on the Earth is in the glaciers. About 30% of that in groundwater, and a little bit in the permafrost. And you know, a very small part of the overall water that's in fresh water. Of the surface water, which is a very small part of the total fresh water, that's broken down. About 2/3 of that's in the lakes, and then rivers, soil moisture, atmosphere, and so forth. So what looks like a really abundant water supply on the planet, when it comes down to actually the water that we can access to use for all of the things that we use water for, it's fairly limited. And the ways that humans use water are broken down roughly into 3 categories. About 70% of that water is used for irrigation. 20% for industry, and 10% for domestic use. So agriculture is a really critical player in the water world. That's where most of the human use of water is allocated. And we know that water demand is going up. This map demonstrating from 1900 up to the present, pretty consistent climb in water demand in all regions of the world, some more than others. But global demand is going up. In fact, the pace of demand growth is accelerating, not decelerating. Even though we're reaching the limits of water availability in many places, the actual demand for economic activities and for food production and for the infinite number of uses that we have for water is going up. So one of the things that I think people sometimes misunderstand is that water is actually part of a closed system. We all know that at some level. You know, water evaporates from the ocean. It floats in clouds back over the land. It comes down onto the land through rain and falls on the land, and some of that infiltrates into the groundwater. A lot of it, is shaped by the watersheds and flows into rivers and streams, and ultimately back out to the ocean. Processes of evaporation and sublimation and a number of other physical processes dictate the course of water as it moves through that closed cycle. But we have the same amount of water that we've always had. Its location, its quality may be different, both its location relative to land or the ocean, or where on land it is, what form it's in, can be variable, but it's a closed system. So the same water molecules are circulating infinitely through this system. The thing that got me excited to work on water when I started working on this 20 years ago at Coca-Cola was that water is fundamental to everything that we care about. If you think about it, water is obviously critical to ecosystems, to keep forests and natural ecosystems functioning in a healthy way. It's critical to agriculture, as I mentioned, with the use of irrigation that makes it possible to grow crops in lots of places that we wouldn't be able to do otherwise. There's just not sufficient rain. It's critical to public health. You know, almost 2/3 of a billion people don't have access to clean water on a regular basis. I've been in many of those communities around the world that don't have access to clean water. And closely associated with that, over 2 billion people who don't have access to sanitation. And water is also really critical to our energy supplies, directly in the case of something like hydroelectric power, but also indirectly by cooling, machinery in a coal power plant, for example. We use a lot of energy, a lot of water for our energy production. Water is also really critical even to something like women's rights, because in many places in the world, women are the stewards of water. And so the fate of water has a really direct impact on the fate of women, and the burden of managing water resources, the impact of unclean water resources. So this is really tied up with issues of gender and social equity in all kinds of complicated and interesting ways. If you look at the amount of annual renewable water supply around the world, this is a map showing by country the annual water supply. That's renewable, so this doesn't include groundwater. And it's an average by country. You can see in 1975 that water availability was an issue in parts of Africa. There was not as abundant resources in Europe as there was in many parts of North America or South America. But, this is a relatively regional issue in 1975 when you look at the kind of national average level. Now, obviously, as you go forward to 2000, you can see that the map gets a little bit lighter. The US popped from water surplus to water abundance, so still not scarce. But you can see as populations grow, obviously the amount per capita goes down. And you can project that out then to 2025 and say, yeah, you can see that the amount of water that's available on a per capita basis is going down. But this doesn't really tell the whole story because these are national averages. And if you take nothing else away from the conversation today, I want you to remember that water is fundamentally local. The water that's available to you might be much in excess or much less than a community that's even a few short miles away if it's in another watershed. And so the local realities of water and where it's found and how it's managed in those watersheds is really critical to understanding the actual water availability that people can make use of in their location. So if you project forward and break it down at the level of subnational water availability, this was a map actually that we commissioned back a few years ago to show the subnational amount of water that's available at the 60-kilometer by 60-kilometer quadrant level. So you could now with new technology, you could get to even much finer grain than this, but I think this tells a pretty compelling story. If you look at, for example, North America, that the western part of the US is really relatively water scarce on a per capita basis compared to the eastern part of the country. You can see China is broken down between the orange, the blue, and the green in really fundamentally different hydrological realities. So at the subnational level, you really see that kind of local nature of water come through in a really strong way. And in fact, water is really highly unequally distributed. So 6 countries in the world make up about half of the total fresh water supply in the world. And they're listed here: Brazil, Russia, Canada, Indonesia, China, and Colombia have half of the water available of the 200 countries around the world. Now, it's true that some of these are very large countries, but there's still a really disproportionate sort of unequal distribution of water resources. And this has huge implications for food security, for economic growth, for population growth, and a lot of other things that we care about, but often don't make the connections between them. It's probably obvious as well, but just to make the point that water and climate really are not two separate things. They're not even just two closely coupled things. They're really two ways of expressing the same nature of the phenomenon. When people talk about climate change, the way that we most viscerally, most directly experience climate change is often in the disruption of water supplies, whether that's through multi-year droughts, whether it's through intense storms, or all of the kind of range of water-related phenomena that is driven by a changing climate that we see around the world. And so I think to think of these as separate things is really a distortion. I'm really excited about this because I think as the university takes on climate change as a real central mission of the university, I think the work that we do on water and the expertise that we have on water is very much at the heart of that discussion. So I just want to put in a plug that this discussion is not separate from the climate initiative or from the climate issue, but is really central to it. Back to the water story, I think another aspect of water that's really important to remember is that it's not just how much water is available, because there's a lot you can do if you are affluent enough to do it. And I contrast 2 cases here, one being Phoenix, Arizona, which is a desert climate, but imports large amount of its water from the Colorado River. It took enormous billions and billions of dollars, an enormous amount of infrastructure and time to build out an infrastructure that allowed for very large cities to operate in places that naturally have very limited water supply. So Phoenix is the result of the affluence of that part of the country investing in being able to move water across long distances, in some sense to release themselves from the limits of the constraints that natural environment naturally requires. On the other hand, you have a place like Ethiopia, which is the source of the Nile. 84% of the Nile's flow originates in that country, and yet across the country, there's many places that face famine and drought because they don't have the infrastructure to move it from where it's abundant to where it is scarce. And so affluence and the power and politics that go along with that affluence have a big role in mediating our experience of water resources. Another factor that's really important is our decisions about how we use water every day can have a dramatic impact. This is satellite pictures of the Aral Sea starting in 1989 on the left panel, and then in 2003 in the middle, and 2009 on the right. And you think, how did this happen in such a short period of time? You know, you're looking at essentially 20 years, a very large sea that essentially had the plug pulled and the water drained from it. This is a complicated story, but one major part of the story is that many of the countries that surround the Aral Sea, this is in the Stans area of Central Asia, decided that they would invest heavily in cotton production, particularly in some of the tributaries that flowed into the Aral Sea. And so those areas saw economic gains because they were able to grow cotton and sell it on the global market. But they diverted water from the streams that fed into the Aral Sea and very rapidly depleted the sustainable supply into that sea and creating the current situation that they're in. So our decisions about how we use water and what economic activities we pursue and what their water footprint is also really critical. This is a busy slide, but it basically makes the point that water is critical for energy and energy is critical for water. I'll give you just a couple of examples. If you, over the duration of a year, the production of electricity to produce one 60-watt incandescent bulb, which we don't have a lot of incandescent bulbs anymore, we use much more efficient bulbs now, but it gives you a sense of that amount of electricity evaporates between 3,000 and 6,000 liters of water in the reservoirs that are used to produce that electricity. On the flip side, running hot water for 5 minutes produces, it requires the energy that's used by a 60-watt bulb for 14 hours. So we don't often think about the huge amount of energy that goes into, converting water to the kind of qualities that we want it to have for things like showering and cleaning and food production and so forth. Pretty interesting statistic in California, about 19% of the state's total electricity is used to move water from where it is, which is in, the sort of the base of the Sierra Nevadas, and move it to the population centers that are west of where the water is, along with 30% of its natural gas and almost 90 billion gallons of diesel that are used every year to move that water. So moving water from where it is to where we need it can be incredibly energy intensive. And water demand for energy is expected to double by 2035. I think one of the big realizations for me is to recognize that water isn't just in the wet stuff that we see, but it's also in the everyday products that we buy every day. Just a few examples: a cotton t-shirt. I mentioned the cotton example with the Aral Sea. The cotton t-shirt takes somewhere between 500 and 2,000 liters of water to grow the cotton to produce one cotton t-shirt. So a massive amount of water that's embedded in a product that we never really associate with water. A slice of cheese has 40 liters. If you have a hamburger and you put that cheese on that hamburger is somewhere between 3,000 and 15,000 liters of water it took to to produce the beef that goes into that hamburger. And a car requires about 40,000 liters. In a classroom situation, I always ask my students where they think the water is actually found, the embedded water in a car, and they usually struggle a long time to find it out. In this case, I'll just tell you, the producing the tires themselves, actually the processes to produce the synthetic rubber are really water intensive. And so a huge amount of water embedded in everyday products that we don't often think about. That has a lot of implications, I think, as we think about water management, that it's not just about dams and reservoirs and water at the faucet, but it's actually about our whole global economy and the products that we produce and where we produce them and where we transport them. So I think really important aspect of the water situation. Maybe I'll just ask you to take a moment and write in the chat. I'm interested in, one of the quotes you often hear when you start working on water issues is, oh, water is going to be the oil of the 21st century. I've heard this more times than I can possibly count. And I think in some ways that's a really interesting insight. I think it's true, but I also think there's some really important differences between water and oil. So let me just take a little poll. What do you think are the ways that water and oil are similar? Maybe you can just put it in the chat. Good. Water and oil are abundant and easy to extract. They're both commodities, international conflict over both. Get transportation, control is power. I think you're hitting on a lot of the ones that I identified as well. Let me just highlight the ones, and this is obviously not an exhaustive list, but both are commodities, as you mentioned. Both are unevenly distributed around the world. They both require massive infrastructure and capital investment. They both are critical to other systems like agriculture, for example, and they're highly interconnected with each other, right? So oil production and the use of water in oil production is really important. Both are highly regulated. So these are really important resources for any society. So there's a lot of regulation that's applied to them. They both are critical to the economy, and they both figure into global conflict. So you got several of those. How about differences? Let's take a moment and just identify ways that water and oil are different. Water is essential to life. Oil isn't. Can't drink oil. That's right. Water provides vast emotional, ecological, and economic benefits. That's right. There's a guy actually who wrote a book called Blue Mind, which is all about that. If any of you have read that book. Water is is renewable closed system, but oil isn't. Yeah. Good. You got a lot of those as well. Water is local, as I pointed out before. At least the market for oil is global. It's also local in terms of where it's found. So in that sense, it's similar. Water is infinitely renewable. It can be used over and over again as long as it's not polluted, whereas oil tends to be combusted and not able to be used multiple times. Water is essential to life. It's part of the public commons. And I think this is actually an interesting aspect from somebody who worked on water resources in business. Is you kind of have to think about it in a bifocal way. Water is both part of the public commons, and in that sense, sort of a human right and infinitely valuable at the same time that it's an economic input to so much of our economy, and often at a level that's very underpriced. So water's highly undervalued. Water governance is highly variable across regions, maybe less so with oil. And I think about the conflict of with water resources being corrosive rather than explosive. What I mean by that is I do think countries go to war over oil. I think there's lots of examples of that. There are certainly conflicts that water is part of, but it tends not to spark all-out war. It tends to be corrosive in relationships between people who have control of water at its headwaters and those who need to benefit from water downstream. So it creates a kind of corrosion in the relationships between people across country boundaries, but also across watersheds and even upstream and downstream in the same region. So these are just some of the highlights. And one thing we know about water is that business as usual is going to lead to a situation where water demand will outstrip supply. And we're seeing that in many places in the world. We can project that, over a period of, a couple decades, water demand is going to go up dramatically. And there's only so many things that we can do about it. Some people say, oh, well, I have faith that we're going to become more efficient over time. And in fact, I think that's true. We have become about 2% more efficient with water use every year, but demand keeps going up faster than 2%. So we're getting those historical improvements in water productivity, but it doesn't counteract the increase in demand. Other people really get excited about supply side solutions like reservoirs. We'll just build more reservoirs, or we'll do desalination. So they have faith in supply side solutions that can ease this burden. But the trouble with, for example, there's problems with lots of these supply side solutions. The trouble with reservoirs, for example, I talked to the person who is responsible for reservoir management in California. He said the biggest problem is that if we want to build a new reservoir, we're not looking at the best site for the reservoir, because we have 1,500 reservoirs in California. We're looking at the 1,501st best site for reservoirs. In other words, we've built in all of the places where it is economically and physically beneficial to build a reservoir, and we have a lot less sites that really make sense. There are similar constraints around desalination. So the point of this slide is we know we'll have efficiency. We know we can do things on the supply side, but there's an enormous gap in between that we're going to have to find a way to close. I'm going to just spend the next few minutes pointing at a few, just at a high level, what I think are some of the categories of the ways that we can close this gap. And then I'll open it up for questions and discussion. So I think there's at least 5 main barriers that are key to closing the supply-demand gap and increasing the productivity of water use. The first is what I call produce more crop per drop. So as I mentioned, 70% of water is used in agriculture. So how do we get more benefit from less water in the agricultural sector? How do we increase water productivity? And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that in a moment. There's obviously lots of interesting technologies that are developing, and this is an area of increasing interest for innovation and venture funding in the water area. I spend a lot of time working with companies on water resources, and I think the corporate efforts to better manage water resources and to be part of the solution to water problems can play an important role in addressing this. And then finally, I think we have to think really critically about what are the systemic barriers that get in the way of managing water resources. So I'm going to just quickly talk through these, and then I'll wrap up and open for questions. So produce more crop per drop. The challenge is that we're going to have to double food production over the next 30 years, and we won't have any more land or water, maybe less land and less water than we have now, to be able to produce that. So where is the innovation going to come from that's going to be able to increase food productivity that way? I think there are a few approaches that might help. The first is that we have to create real market signals to deliver and apply water to crops more efficiently. There are many places in the world where the subsidies for water have the perverse impact that it encourages people to waste water because they don't pay for that water, and they can afford to do flood irrigation, where a much more precise sort of use of water would even produce better crop outcomes at a fraction of the amount of water input. So I think it's important that we think about how do we create the right market signals to incent people to do that, both at a policy level as well as at an everyday sort of business decision-making level. Second is, I think there's a lot of crop and production innovations that can increase yield and reduce resource use. So the investments we're making in things like drought-resistant crops, or prolonging the life of vegetables in the marketplace. There's lots of interesting innovation that are happening around innovation on a scientific and technical basis that I think can play a really important role. But ultimately, I think there's going to have to be kind of a reconsideration of what our diets consist of and how do we satisfy at scale the kind of nutritional needs that we have in ways that use less water. I think that certainly means looking at our meat consumption. I'm not arguing that we can't eat meat, but I think we have to understand what the water footprint and the requirement of that meat production is in our decision making. And finally, I mentioned before, this idea of embedded water suggests to me that in some ways we're actually transporting water across boundaries when we're trading products. If we're growing very water intensive crops in one place and we're transferring that to another basin or another country, we're actually transferring that kind of embedded water from one place to another. And I don't think very often do we really think about the water consequences of our global trade policies. And so I think that's another lever for us to begin to think about where is the water in the world, where are the places that can afford to do those things that are more water intensive, and how do we build a more water aware global trade system. Second is around enhancing water productivity. And this is an example from India. And this is a cost curve, essentially reading from left to right. The things in the left, the yellow boxes, are the most economical ways to reduce water use and or increase productivity. And in India, you can see almost all of those are in the agricultural sector. So from reduced over irrigation, balancing fertilizers better, using rain-fed drainage, there's a number of solutions that could really make big impact in improving productivity. There are supply side solutions, if you see on the right, linking rivers, creating more dams, using rainwater harvesting, but these all tend to be much more expensive than the things that could be done in agriculture. And the map of what are the things that really drive water productivity looks very different in different countries. So anyway, just a snapshot of the kinds of things that I think are part of the menu we can use to improve productivity. There are new technologies in agriculture, in industrial use, and particularly in wastewater that I think have a lot of potential. Some of them are listed here. So things like desalination, water efficiency, disinfection technologies, and so forth can have a big impact. I use the little paint can example up in the right. There's a new product on the market where you can paint pipes that are underground with a paint that has micro fibers in it. And when the pipe starts to break, those fibers send a small signal, and you can actually monitor from over the road where pipes are beginning to break before they actually rupture and lose water. So very ingenious ways to anticipate where you might have accidents or incidents that lose a lot of water. I think there's a lot we can do to drive this. Because we haven't paid much attention to water waste in the past, because it's been so cheap, I think there's enormous opportunities to use water much more intelligently than what we've done up till now. There's lots that companies can do. I worked at Coca-Cola, and we spent a lot of time thinking about what Coke can do to partner with other NGOs and local governments around water use. That varied in different places. In some places that was around water and sanitation. In others, it was around watershed protection. But I think there's a lot that companies that are using a lot of water, like food companies and beverage companies can do in this space, or big industrial users. Levi Strauss has a waterless jeans. Cotton, as I mentioned, is a big water user. And they've been able to produce products that use much less water. So really trying to market their water efficiency and their water stewardship and the products that they sell. Puma's done some interesting work in really building in water accounting into their overall economic balance sheets. So I think there's a lot that we can do to recognize water as a resource on the balance sheets, the profit and loss of companies as well. Finally, I won't go through this in detail, but I just want to point out there's a lot of systemic barriers to adopting these new approaches. Some are financial. A lot of these things take a lot of upfront investment to really get the gains, and there's lots of transaction costs. Some of them are political. The people who benefit are not often the people who have to make the decisions to make these investments. There are structural and organizational capacity issues. We don't always have the skills or the talent, the capacity to really develop these solutions where they're most needed. And water has, very small mind share. People don't think about water resources until they're in crisis. I call it drought mind. People either are completely indifferent to water resources, or they're completely in a panic about a drought coming. And so I'll just wrap up. The 4 points I want to leave you with: water is essential to everything we care about. water demand is skyrocketing and additional supplies are limited. Because there's so much waste, I think there's enormous opportunities to do things that can make a huge difference in this space. And smart investment and partnerships are going to be really key to pull it off. So I'll conclude with that. Thanks, everybody. I look forward to hearing your questions.
Great, thanks, Dan. We've got actually a very early on question from Ken Smith. How concerned should we be about what international corporations are doing to privatize water supply in foreign countries? For example, Dasani, Coke in Mexico, as shown in the documentary Blue Gold.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, so here's the dilemma. There's lots of municipalities all around the world that aren't delivering water, especially to the people who are, most needing, but not necessarily having the financial resources to pay for it. And so municipalities in many places have not done the job that they need to provide water for their people. And it's sometimes an easy way out to hire a multinational company to come in and manage those resources and apply a price. Now, for that company to be able to do that in a sustainable way, they often have to increase the price of water because water has been subsidized in those places. But there's often a regressive impact of those increased water prices so that the poor can't afford water for basic things. So I'm not a fan of privatization. I don't think that there's lots of examples where privatization has gone south. Bolivia is a great example where bringing in an outside company who raised the rates and basically, made it impossible for people to get water is not a solution that's going to work long term. But I think the backdrop of this is status quo is also not working, which is municipalities are not providing what they need to for their communities either. So what I'd like to see is much more focus on how do you provide the training and the resources to the municipal government that actually owns accountability to provide water to their people and do it in an equitable way. So, I think you're right to be concerned about water privatization. There are places in the world where privatization does work. I think sometimes when the prices go up, it more reflects the real value of water. So I'm not saying universally privatization is always bad, but I think especially in countries that are, low income, privatization has really not worked.
Great other question we've got from German. How feasible is it to make seawater drinkable?
Well, it's very feasible. We know how to do it. We have desalination technologies, and there are places like the Middle East, for example, which rely almost exclusively on desalinated water. So we know how to do it. I guess there's three problems. One is that it's a lot more expensive. Having to desalinate water versus better management of your freshwater resources is inherently going to be more costly. So that's the first problem. The second is that it's inefficient. There's always a water that's rejected from that process. So it's less efficient to desalinate water. And that often means that you're running some kind of equipment, which has its own carbon footprint to do the desalination. So you're creating a higher carbon footprint to get the water that you need versus using a freshwater water resource. And the third problem is that it produces a byproduct, which is really nasty, which is brine. So when you take salt out, that salt doesn't disappear. It's a waste product. And if you're not careful, if you put that salt product back into the ocean where you were sourcing it, you might increase the salinity of that bay if it doesn't really flush very accurately. Now that's on the radar for people, so they know that and they try to manage around that. But I think there's economic, there's carbon footprint, and there's waste problems that make it not a solution that works for everyone. The other obvious thing is there are a lot of places that don't have access to seawater either, right? So if you're inland, then desalination isn't necessarily a very good option either. So I think it's a useful tool, but it's not a panacea.
Yeah. Question from Cindy Tripp. I know you said that water is corrosive, not explosive, war spot over oil, but are we approaching a pivot where that will change? The water is where the conflict will be, and oil will fall away as oil-based energy is being replaced through innovations.
Hmm. Yeah, maybe so. I guess I'm heartened that in lots of places in the world, there has been a surprisingly high level of cooperation in many places of the world. Now, there are regions of the world where that's clearly not the case. But I do think that people have a sense of how critical water is, and to cut off water resources from people is really a life and death thing. So I think there's a level of care about that. They understand the stakes in using water as a weapon that I think have allowed people to find common ground and reach a point of agreement in many parts of the world. Now, I can give you many examples where that's not the case too, so it's not a universal statement. That pivot might happen. I just think there's something about water that isn't organized by country. It's not controlled by countries in the same way. It's managed at a very local level in a way that I think oil resources really often, they're controlled by, managed by national oil companies. So we don't have one entity that controls water resources that directly is aligned with the government. So I just think the governance of water, because it's more widely distributed, because it needs to be locally managed, doesn't lend itself to the same kind of conflict dynamics that you find over oil. That doesn't mean that things won't get more acute, that there won't be more conflict. I just think it's going to be one element in a whole set of things around food and around climate impacts and around migration of people. It won't be the only thing. It'll be part of a construct that feeds into conflicts and makes them worse.
Yeah. When we were developing the content for this series, one of the quotes that we stumbled across has been attributed to Mark Twain, whether or not he actually said it, but he said that whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting over. And I think that sort of gets to what you're talking about in this particular
Absolutely.
case.
Yeah.
All right. Another question: is water above or below climate change in urgency? And this gets to some stuff we've talked about before, and your work specifically with oceans and how that fits into the climate conversation. So if you could sort of elaborate on that, I think that would be helpful in this question.
Yeah, I don't like to rank these as separate things because they're so interrelated, and sometimes the most powerful levers to address one thing, or like to address climate, might actually be in water or might be in the ocean. I'll give you a few examples of that. So if California could bring down its water use, significantly in the big cities, it would have a direct impact on how much, oil and natural gas and diesel fuel they're using to run the pumps to deliver water from the Central Valley. And that would have a pretty significant impact on your climate footprint. So I think it's more important to see the connections between these domains and understand that ecological systems, these are all part of the same system. As I talked about, water is a closed system, right? It starts in the ocean. The climate system is what evaporates it and drives the movement of it in clouds over the land, and then it rains down as water onto the surface of the planet. So I don't think you can really rank them. I think the urgency, climate is something that's kind of I think it's got kind of knock-on effects. So I think a lot of the water issues that we're seeing, like, for example, in Cape Town approached day zero a couple of years ago, where they were really worried about running out of water altogether. They had to take really rash action in cutting back agricultural and domestic water use until they could find a way to kind of reallocate water. There's no way that wasn't driven by climate change. So I think to say that climate is more important than water is not really accurate. I think what I would say is we can expect that climate's going to have massive impacts on water. I think we can find in water and oceans a lot of levers that could have a positive benefit on the climate.
Great. Could you elaborate on how the fate of water impacts the fate of women?
Yeah, so I spent time in Kenya. We had a big program there to bring water wells to communities that didn't have it, along with sanitation. We also worked in the primary schools, creating safe water clubs, teaching kids about water and how water can become a source of infection. But it directly affected women for example, because in the community I was in, they spent about 5 hours a day sourcing water. So the well was about 2.5 hours away from the community. So they took the biggest buckets that they could carry, 2.5 hours to the well. They filled them up at that well, and then they walked back to their community. So a huge part of their day was actually going out and sourcing water. And, as water resources become more and more scarce, those wells dry up, and it may be even further for them to have to go to do it. So when you're able to provide water from a well that's a sustainable source that's adjacent to that community, you immediately give 5 hours a day back to that woman that she didn't have otherwise. And that enables a whole set of things that women can do. I was approached in one community where we did this, and there were 3 women that we had a ceremony to sort of commission the well, and we were done with the ceremony. I was walking back to the car to leave, and these women were pointing at me, and finally they came over. One grabbed me by the arm and said, "We need to talk to you." I said, "Oh, okay." They said, before we had this well, we had to walk 5 hours every day to get water. We'd never had time to do anything else. We had to buy our food at the market because we didn't have time for a garden. And life was really tough. And her 2 friends are like, "Tell them the good part, tell them the good part." So then in Swahili, and then she said in English, she said, "So let me tell you what life is like now. We have water that runs in this pipe right behind our community now. I go and I turn the tap and I get water." So this gave me time to invest in my home and in my community. So we started planting gardens in our backyard, which we never had time to do. And we also didn't have the water. So now we're growing cabbage and tomatoes, and we're producing food that we eat. This has gone so well, we're producing excess amount of vegetables that we can't consume. And we have time then to go down to the market, and we're selling our crops at the market. And actually, we're making more money now than our husbands are through our vegetable sales. And they're pooling their money, and they're beginning to think about what they could do to set up their own business. And so you can kind of see how water is a kind of foundation for this virtuous cycle where it enables women in particular to find resources that they didn't have access to before, and really pursue entrepreneurial opportunities and other opportunities to make their lives better. So that's just a really concrete example of how I think it directly impacts women's welfare and women's rights.
All right, got another question. You mentioned the book Blue Mind. Why is there an active avoidance to recognizing the science and practice related to the emotional health and wellness benefits of water, especially considering the very high and costly levels of anxiety, stress, and burnout? I've actually met with Jay, who's an alum. I can post his link in the chat as well. It's an interesting sort of green space we pay attention to, but blue space seems to be a little bit less of a common conversation.
Well, in our Oceans at Duke work, we've been trying to find a way in at the medical school for that very reason, because I think actually Duke's strength in medicine and in healthcare is an obvious place where we could really help to connect the dots on the role that oceans and water resources more generally can play in emotional health and in fitness and in a whole set of things that the world desperately needs right now. So I don't have any big answer for why we haven't made that connection more strongly before, but I think it's a really untapped resource. And I would love to see Duke really champion that.
Yeah, you mentioned the Oceans at Duke program. You want to talk a little bit more about that, because it's one of the spaces I'm really excited about. It's sort of developed in the last couple of years. So if you want to share with the class.
Well, and I kind of think of my career. I started out in the Himalayas, at the top of the mountain peaks, and then worked on water for a long time. And now that I'm getting old enough, I'm actually flowing out into the ocean. So my career has kind of followed the water course. About 2 years ago, I generally work on sort of the intersection of big global challenges and business strategy. That's what my whole career has been focused on. And I took a step back and I said, well, where are the areas around these big global challenges that Duke has like globally recognized strength? And as I began to explore it, it was clear that oceans is an area that is really like Duke is in some corners actually referred to as Ocean's U, which I had never heard that term before, but it's very well known in certain quarters for the strength and depth of its ocean expertise. And what's interesting about it, we have the Marine Lab, which is an incredible asset with 20 odd faculty who are world-class scientists and social scientists doing work there. But we also have faculty in almost every other school, from engineering to law to public policy to business, medicine, who are doing work that is very relevant to oceans. And it just occurred as I began to kind of reach out to some of my colleagues in the other schools that we should really form a community to kind of not do anything that the school's not already doing. The university already has incredible strength, but can we really bring that together and amplify the message that we have to share around oceans? I think the timing was really fortuitous because we made the case that oceans are such a critical part of the climate system. Most of the carbon emissions are not actually in the atmosphere, they're in the ocean. 93+% of the heat that has been created by humans through climate change is absorbed by the ocean. A huge carbon sink opportunity is to really protect and make sure that the carbon sink of the ocean continues to function properly. So I think we build this community. We've been doing a webinar series over the last year. We've had 7 or 8 webinars that really highlight the strength of the faculty. And every time we asked the faculty to present, they brought in their colleagues from around the world doing really important work on policy and science. So it's not just Duke, Duke is the hub of a global network of experts in this area doing really fascinating work. And I think the sky's the limit of what's possible here. We're really trying to build on that. The webinar series, we have the last one, the last one next week, and then we're doing sort of a greatest hits of it in April to kind of highlight what are the key themes around oceans that people should be paying attention to before the UN Oceans Conference in Portugal next June. But we're really excited that I think oceans is an area where we have strengths that we can really build on. I think it will distinguish us in our climate initiative, because I don't think many other schools have the strength in oceans and being able to connect the dots between oceans and climate that we do. So anyway, stay tuned on that. I think you were posting the Oceans at Duke website that has a lot of those resources, and hopefully people will be able to be part of that conversation too.
Yeah, and the Blue Summit's coming up, I think, next month. And we're going to make that content available to alumni as well. So if you haven't checked out the syllabus yet, for this particular series, that includes all the links that we can offer for alumni accessing some of these different resources. So you can find all of those there, and they're including, somebody asked about books about water conservation and quality. There are some links in that syllabus as well for some additional reading that we've sourced from different faculty members. So
Jen, can I just mention one more thing on the ocean front? So we launched this faculty community that we called Oceans at Duke. But some of the students got so excited about this idea of a cross-Duke ocean community that graduate students from some of the graduate schools got together and decided that they would form a student club that was sort of parallel to the faculty group. There's now 130 members of that student club across every school in the university. And their signature event is this Blue Economy Summit that they're holding on March 18 and 19. So, and some of that will be broadcast as well. So just wanted to give a kind of a shout out to the students. Are super engaged on this. They really care a lot about these issues. They love when we can connect the dots between the different schools. They're looking at careers across policy and business and science, and to be a part of a community of people doing all of those things is really, I think, empowering for them.
That's great. That's really great to see. The last thing I wanted to bring up, because we've talked about this briefly, is the MBA Edge opportunity, which is a great resource for people that you've worked with at Fuqua, and we'll post that link in there as well for everybody to access. But if you want to say a quick couple words about that before we wrap up.
Yeah, sure. My Edge Center, we work a lot with, industry partners. We have an advisory board of 20 plus companies, and we do a lot of consulting work with companies. And we identified a real need that, especially in the last few years, not just the sustainability specialists, but executives up and down the ranks and across industries needed to come up to speed on what were, the climate risks that companies are facing. What is this water issue and how might it affect them? What is ESG investment? And, what are investors expecting of companies around their environmental and social and governance performance? And we felt like there's a need for easily accessed free information on these kinds of topics. And we really were targeting MBAs. So the series of briefings, we had one on climate change in business, what every MBA needs to know, water in business, what every MBA needs to know, and so forth. What we found is a lot of our corporate partners were coming to us and say, well, I know you made that for MBAs, but I actually am sending it to our senior executives because they don't know these things either. And having a 4, 5, 6 page briefing of really current information about the highlights of these topics so that you can go from knowing nothing to being able to have an intelligent conversation with an expert in about half an hour of time is really valuable. So the website we just launched in the last 6 months or so, there's several documents that are topical briefings. There's also some guides on sustainability kind of skill sets, things like sustainability reporting or materiality assessment. And the last series we launched is called Markets to Watch. So it's things like energy storage and offshore wind, sort of the industries that may be relatively small now, but are growing really rapidly and will be great opportunity spaces for our students over the long term. So take a look. It's at mba-edge.com.
Yep, that link is in the chat as well. And with that, we are actually going to wrap up this evening's session. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us for tonight's conversation that is in the World of Water topic on the Institute for the spring series. Our next session is going to be March 15th. It's at 3 p.m. Eastern, and it's on the politics of water. We've got some fantastic faculty members coming in from across the university. So join us for that session, and I hope to see you there. Thanks so much. Have a great night.
Thanks, everybody.